After reviewing the evidence that's been made public, I cannot help but conclude that this president has attacked each of the Constitution's safeguards against establishing a monarchy in this country. Both the context and gravity of the president's misconduct are clear. The favor he requested from Ukraine's president was to receive, in exchange for his use of presidential power, Ukraine's announcement of a criminal investigation of a political rival. The investigation was not the important action for the president. The announcement was, because it could then be used in this country to manipulate the public into casting aside the president's political rival because of concerns about his corruption. The gravity of the president's misconduct is apparent when we compare it to the misconduct of the one president who resigned from office to avoid impeachment, conviction, and removal. The House Judiciary Committee in 1974 approved 3 articles of impeachment against Richard Nixon, who resigned a few days later. The first article charged him with obstruction of justice. If you read the Mueller report, it identifies a number of facts, I won't lay them out here right now, that suggest the president himself has obstructed justice. If we look at the second article of impeachment approved against Richard Nixon, it charged him with abuse of power for ordering the heads of the FBI, IRS, and CIA to harass his political enemies. In the present circumstance, the president has engaged in a pattern of abusing the trust placed in him by the American people by soliciting foreign countries, including China, Russia, and Ukraine, to investigate his political opponents and interfere on his behalf in elections in which he is a candidate. The third article approved against President Nixon charged that he had failed to comply with 4 legislative subpoenas. In the present circumstance, the president has refused to comply with and directed at least 10 others in his administration not to comply with lawful congressional subpoenas, including Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, Energy Secretary Rick Perry, and Acting Chief of Staff and Head of the Office of Management and Budget, Mick Mulvaney. As Senator Lindsey Graham, now chair of the Senate Judiciary Committee, said when he was a member of the House on the verge of impeaching President Clinton, the day Richard Nixon failed to answer that subpoena is the day he was subject to impeachment because he took the power from Congress over the impeachment process away from Congress, and he became the judge and jury. That is a perfectly good articulation of why obstruction of Congress is impeachable.
But what's not new is basically what's just been reiterated by the chairman. What's not new is the facts. What's not new is it's the same sad story. What's interesting, even before I get into my part of my opening statement, is this what was just said by the chairman. We went back to a redo of Mr. Mueller. We're also saying, quoting him, saying the attention of the American people should be on foreign interference. I agree with him completely, except I guess the American people did not include the Judiciary Committee because we didn't take it up. We didn't have hearings. We didn't do anything to delve deeply into this issue. We passed election bills, but did not get into the in-depth part of what Mr. Mueller talked about, taking his own report and having hearings about that. We didn't do it. So I guess the American people doesn't include the House Judiciary Committee. You know, we also just heard an interesting discussion. We're going to have a lot of interesting discussion today about the Constitution and other things, but we also talked about the founders. What's interesting is that the chairman talked a lot about the founders from the quotes, and again, this is why we have the hearing, about the founders being concerned about foreign influence, but what he also didn't quote was the founders being really, really concerned about political impeachment, because you just don't like the guy. You haven't liked him since November of 2016. The chairman has talked about impeachment since last year when he was elected chairman, 2 years ago, November 17th, before he's even sworn in as chairman. So don't tell me this is about new evidence and new things and new stuff. We may have a new hearing room, we may have new mics, and we may have chairs that aren't comfortable, but this is nothing new, folks. This is sad. So what do we have here today? You know what I'm thinking? I looked at this, and what is interesting is there's 2 things that have become very clear. This impeachment is not really about facts. If it was, I believe the other committees would have sent over recommendations for impeachment. No, they're putting it on this committee because if it goes badly, I guess they want to blame Adam Schiff's committee and the HISPC and others want to blame this committee for it going bad. But they're already drafting articles. Don't be fooled. They're already getting ready for this. We've already went after this with the Ukraine after numerous failings of Mueller, Cohen, annulments, the list goes, emoluments, the list goes on. But the American people are actually failing to see us legislate. But if you want to know what's really driving this, there's 2 things. It's called the clock and the calendar. The clock and the calendar. Most people in life, if you want to know what they truly value, you look at their checkbook and their calendar. You know what they value. That's what this committee values. Time. They want to do it before the end of the year. Why? Because the chairman said it just a second ago. Because we're scared of the elections next year. We're scared of the elections that we'll lose again. So we've got to do this now. The clock and the calendar are what's driving impeachment, not the facts.
The framers provided for the impeachment of the president because they feared that the president might abuse the power of his office for personal benefit, to corrupt the electoral process and ensure his re-election, or to subvert the national security of the United States. High crimes and misdemeanors are abuses of power and of public trust connected to the office of the presidency. On the basis of the testimony and the evidence before the House, President Trump has committed impeachable high crimes and misdemeanors by corruptly abusing the office of the presidency. Specifically, President Trump has abused his office by corruptly soliciting President Volodymyr Zelensky of Ukraine to announce investigations of his political rivals in order to gain personal advantage, including in the 2020 presidential election.
Based on the evidentiary record before you, what has happened in the case today is something that I do not think we have ever seen before. A president who has doubled down on violating his oath to faithfully execute the laws and to protect and defend the Constitution. The evidence reveals a president who used the powers of his office to demand that a foreign government participate in undermining a competing candidate for the presidency. As President John Kennedy declared, the right to vote in a free American election is the most powerful and precious right in the world. But our elections become less free when they are distorted by foreign interference. What happened in 2016 was bad enough. There is widespread agreement that Russian operatives intervened to manipulate our political process. But that distortion is magnified if a sitting president abuses the powers of his office actually to invite foreign intervention. To see why, imagine living in a part of Louisiana or Texas that's prone to devastating hurricanes and flooding. What would you think if you lived there and your governor asked for a meeting with the president to discuss getting disaster aid that Congress has provided for? What would you think if that president said, I would like you to do us a favor. I'll meet with you, and I'll send the disaster relief once you brand my opponent a criminal? Wouldn't you know in your gut that such a president had abused his office, that he'd betrayed the national interest, and that he was trying to corrupt the electoral process? I believe that the evidentiary record shows wrongful acts on that scale here. It shows a president who delayed meeting a foreign leader and providing assistance that Congress and his own advisors agreed serves our national interest in promoting democracy and in limiting Russian aggression. Saying, Russia, if you're listening, you know, a president who cared about the Constitution would say, Russia, if you're listening, butt out of our elections. And it shows a president who did this to strong-arm a foreign leader into smearing one of the president's opponents in our ongoing election season. That's not politics as usual, at least not in the United States or not in any mature democracy. It is instead a cardinal reason why the Constitution contains an impeachment power. Put simply, a president should resist foreign interference in our elections, not demand it and not welcome it.
What comparisons, Professor Carlin, can we make between kings that the framers were afraid of and the president's conduct today?
So kings could do no wrong because the king's word was law. And contrary to what President Trump has said, Article 2 does not give him the power to do anything he wants. And I'll just give you one example that shows you the difference between him and a king, which is the Constitution says there can be no titles of nobility. So while the president can name his son Baron, he can't make him a baron. I want to apologize for what I said earlier about the president's son. It was wrong of me to do that. I wish the president would apologize, obviously, for the things that he's done that's wrong, but I do regret having said that.
I ask unanimous consent to insert into the record a letter I wrote and sent to you calling on you to cancel any and all future impeachment hearings and outlining how the process...
Without objection, the letter will be entered into the record.
Thank you. During an interview, Mr. Chairman, on MSNBC's Morning Joe, on November 26, 2018, Chairman Nadler outlined a three-pronged test that he said would allow for a legitimate impeachment proceeding. Now, I quote Chairman Nadler's remarks. And this is what he said. There really are three questions, I think. First, has the president committed impeachable offenses? Second, do those offenses rise to the gravity that's worth putting the country through the drama of impeachment? And number three, because you don't want to tear the country apart, you don't want half of the country to say to the other half for the next 30 years, we won the election, you stole it from us. You have to be able to think at the beginning of the impeachment process that the evidence is so clear, of offenses so grave, that once you've laid out all of the evidence, a good fraction of the opposition, the voters, will reluctantly admit to themselves they had to do it. Otherwise, you have a partisan impeachment which will tear the country apart. If you meet these three tests, then I think you do the impeachment. And those were the words of Chairman Nadler. Now, let's see if Chairman Nadler's three-pronged test has been met. First, has the president committed an impeachable offense? No. The evidence and testimony has not revealed any impeachable offense. Second, do those offenses rise to the gravity that's worth putting the country through the drama of impeachment? Again, the answer is no. There is nothing here that rises to the gravity that's worth putting the country through the drama of impeachment. And third, have the Democrats laid out a case so clear that even the opposition has to agree? Absolutely not. You and House Democrat leadership are tearing apart the country. You said the evidence needs to be clear. It is not. You said offenses need to be grave. They are not. You said that once the evidence is laid out, that the opposition will admit they had to do it. That has not happened. In fact, polling and the fact that not one single Republican voted on the impeachment inquiry resolution or on the Schiff report reveal the opposite is true. In fact, what you and your Democratic colleagues have done is opposite of what you said had to be done. This is a partisan impeachment, and it is tearing the country apart. I take this all to mean that Chairman Nadler, along with the rest of the Democratic caucus, is prepared to continue these entirely partisan, unfair proceedings and traumatize the American people, all for a political purpose. I think that's a shame. That's not leadership. That's a sham. And so I ask Mr. Turley, has Chairman Nadler satisfied his three-pronged test for impeachment?
With all due respect to the Chairman, I do not believe that those factors were satisfied.
Thank you. And I want to correct something for the record as well. Repeatedly today and other days, Democrats have repeated what was said in the text of the call. Do me a favor, though, and they imply it was against President Biden, to investigate President Biden. It was not. It was not. In fact, let me read what the transcript says. It says, the President Trump. I would like you to do us a favor, though, because our country has been through a lot and Ukraine knows a lot about it. I would like you to find out what happened with this whole situation with Ukraine. They say CrowdStrike. I guess you have one of your own wealthy people. It says nothing about the Bidens.
In this country, no one, not even the president, is above the law. Today, we began our conversation where we should, with the text of the Constitution. We have heard clearly from our witnesses that the Constitution compels action. Indeed, every witness, including the witness selected by the Republican side, agreed that if President Trump did what the Intelligence Committee found him to have done, after extensive and compelling witnesses from the Trump administration officials, he committed impeachable offenses. While the Republican witness may not be convinced that there is sufficient evidence that the President engaged in these acts, the American people and the majority of this committee disagree. I also think that the Republican witness, Professor Turley, issued a sage warning in 1998 when he was a leading advocate for the impeachment of Bill Clinton. He said, quote, "If you decide that certain acts do not rise to impeachable offenses, you will expand the space for executive conduct," close quote. That was the caution of Professor Turley in 1998 in the impeachment of President Clinton. That caution should guide us all today. And by any account, that warning is infinitely more applicable to the abuses of power we are contemplating today. Because, as we all know, if these abuses go unchecked, they will only continue and only grow worse. Each of us took an oath to defend the Constitution. The President is a continuing threat to that Constitution and to our democracy. I will honor my oath. And as I sit here today, having heard consistent, clear, and compelling evidence that the President has abused his power, attempted to undermine the constitutional role of Congress, and corrupted our elections, I urge my colleagues, stand behind the oath you have taken. Our democracy depends on it. This concludes today's hearing.
Mr. Chairman, I have one thing. Mr.
For
Chairman,
what purpose does the gentleman seek recognition?
thank you, Mr. Chairman. Pursuant to Committee Rule 8, I am giving notice to intent to file dissenting views to the committee's report on constitutional grounds for presidential impeachment.
Noted. This concludes today's hearing.
Chairman.
We thank all of our witnesses for participating.
Chairman, I'd ask
Without objection, all
unanimous
members will
consent.
have 5 legislative days to submit additional written questions for the witnesses or additional materials.
We have a unanimous consent request.
Too late.
Unanimous.
For the witnesses
Too
or
late?
additional
It's too late
materials
for
for
a
the
unanimous
record.
consent request?
Without objection, the hearing is adjourned.
Yeah,
Give
that's
me a break.
just typical, isn't it? Just typical.